As soon as my truck appeared around the bend, at the end of the line of vehicles, the atmosphere at the police checkpoint changed. Conversation stopped halfway through. One of the officers reached for his holster. Another hurriedly raised his radio. They weren't trying to figure out who I was. They were trying to confirm if that white truck with its blue logo on the door and impeccable reflective strips was the same one that had been appearing in reports in recent days. The order to pull over came abruptly, with firm gestures. One patrol car moved quickly to block my rear. Another took up position to the side, creating a frame of blue lights around the cab. I slowly turned off the engine, obeyed each signal, and for a few seconds only three things existed. The sound of the cooling fan stopping, the breath caught in my chest, and the gaze of the police officers circling the truck as if they had owned that scene for a long time. I was removed from the cabin following a high-risk protocol. There was no shouting, but there was no kindness either. They asked my name, destination, origin, company, and route for the last few days. Meanwhile, two others walked around the entire vehicle, noting the license plate, checking the chassis number, examining the side as if looking for a specific scratch, a detail that would confirm something. When they returned with my documents, the change in attitude was clear. The tension eased but didn't disappear. It was the kind of relief you feel when you realize that some piece of the puzzle doesn't fit, but you still can't explain why. They told me to keep going. No explanation, no comment. Just a signal to leave the roadblock and get back on the highway. I put the truck back into the flow of traffic with the irritating feeling of having been treated like someone I'm not, without having the right to know why. The cargo that day didn't warrant so much attention. Boxes of industrial cleaning products, a clean invoice, a common route crossing southern Georgia towards Florida. The truck, on the other hand, was exactly what any police officer describes when talking about a fleet vehicle. White cab, simple logo, reflective stripes, bumper with the company name. A truck that has nothing remarkable about it, precisely because it was chosen to be discreet. Hours later, I stopped at a large gas station. I pulled the truck over to the side and went to the convenience store. While I was paying for my coffee, I noticed the clerk looking out the window toward the parking lot, then turning her gaze back to me. She mentioned seeing a truck exactly like mine 2 days earlier, parked in almost the same spot. She talked about the color, the logo, the bumper stripe. She even added that she remembered a discreet scratch near the fuel tank. I laughed awkwardly and mentioned the large fleet, explaining that the company had identical trucks spread throughout the country. She nodded, but her expression said otherwise. For her, it wasn't just similar. It was the same. The next day, in another small town, I stopped at a roadside restaurant. I parked in the truck parking area and went inside. When I finished my meal and went to pay, the cashier asked if I had decided to come back so quickly. He thought I was the same trucker who had been there the night before, parked with an identical truck. I asked him what he meant by identical. He described everything: the blue logo on the door, the color of the cab, the placement of the stickers, even the exact spot of wear on the reflective strip. It was as if he were describing my truck parked outside at that moment. I told the truth. I had never driven there before. He insisted for a few seconds, then shrugged and concluded with, "Then I must have been mistaken." But it was too late. The seed had been planted. At each new stop, someone seemed to recognize the truck before recognizing me. At a loading dock, a security guard commented that white truck from your company had caused trouble at another gas station the previous week, involved in strange activity with cars pulling up and leaving too quickly. In another city, a gas station attendant asked if I had already resolved the problem with the police, as if he knew a story that didn't belong to me. The pattern repeated itself with increasing unease. Different people, different places, always the same idea. Someone just like me, with a truck just like mine, had already passed by doing something that didn't match my routine. It wasn't just a fleet coincidence anymore. It was outright confusion. The breaking point came when a distribution center manager asked me to go to the camera room. He opened a video file from a gas station in another city, captured by a tall, angled camera. In the grainy image, a truck identical to mine entered the yard, maneuvered slowly and parked in a specific spot, creating a cone of shadow between the trailer and the side wall. A few minutes later, A black sedan pulled up in that shadow, so close to the truck that, in most cameras, it simply disappeared. Only one angle, higher and further away, managed to show some of the movement. People got out, quickly exchanged items, returned to the car and left. There was no loading or unloading of the truck. The vehicle was there only to block the view and create a blind spot for the surveillance system. The manager fast-forwarded the video. Another city, another gas station. The same scene repeating itself with minimal differences. An identical truck parking in strategically bad locations for the cameras, smaller cars using that white mass as a shield, quick and silent movement, without any relation to an invoice or loading dock. In all the recordings, the truck was the same. White cab, blue logo, reflective stripes, inspection stickers in the same positions. In one of them, even a scratch mark on the side was very reminiscent of the wear and tear on mine. It wasn't just a vehicle from the same company. In the eyes of the cameras, it was my truck. When the video ended, the manager took a deep breath and said there was an ongoing investigation. The police were tracking a fleet truck used as cover in a larger criminal operation. They didn't know exactly what was being transported, but they knew the truck served as a barrier for quick drug exchanges, and they knew the description matched mine. From that day on, driving ceased to be an automatic movement. I began to obsessively record everything: times, stops, notes, receipt signatures, anything that could prove where I was at each point on the map. The feeling of being mistaken for a criminal wasn't abstract. It was concrete, with images, reports, and roadblocks. A few days later, I stopped at a gas station in the late afternoon. While I was filling up, I noticed a security guard standing near the store, staring intently at the side of the truck. He was talking on the radio, describing the colors, the logo, the arrangement of the stickers. Then he walked to the back, checked the license plate, and repeated the sequence of letters and numbers. A short time later, a police car drove slowly through the parking lot, slowing down near my spot, and then drove off without stopping. It wasn't a police stop, but it wasn't a coincidence either. The climax came on a rainy night on an interstate highway. The lanes glistened with glare from the lights, water pooled on the sides, and the wiper blades barely kept the windshield usable. When I spotted cones and vehicles ahead, I slowed down. Another roadblock. This time, the structure was larger. There were patrol cars on both sides, cones guiding vehicles through a narrow corridor, and police officers in raincoats reflecting red and blue light. As soon as my truck came into the main field of vision, the pattern repeated itself. One of the policemen pointed directly at the cab, said something on the radio. Another patrol car turned on its lights and positioned itself behind me. I was directed to an isolated area, away from the flow of traffic. The sound of the rain on the roof made the air heavier, as if the whole world had shrunk to fit into that soaked yard. One of the agents approached carrying a clipboard with a laminated sheet of paper. Even from a distance, I recognized what was printed there. An image of a white truck with a blue logo, captured by some security camera. From the way he compared the paper to the front of my vehicle, I knew that the truck in the photo was the same one from the recordings I had seen. The questions were direct and chronological. Where I had been 3 days prior, where I had slept the previous week, what times I had left certain cities, what routes I had used to get there. I answered everything, showing invoices, unloading receipts, time records, any document that proved my location on specific dates. They cross-referenced the information by radio with someone outside the checkpoint. Gradually, the atmosphere changed. The initial rigidity gave way to a resigned weariness. I was released again without an apology, just the gesture to climb into the cab and leave. That moment was enough for me to understand that the problem wasn't with me as a person. It was with the truck I was driving. The next day I called the department responsible for the company's fleet and calmly recounted everything from beginning to end. The first roadblock, the comments at gas stations, the recordings, the rainy night, the laminated sheet, the questions. I said it was no longer a matter of discomfort. It was a real risk. If someone involved in a crime was using a twin truck as a shield, I was a walking target, ready to be mistaken for someone else in any encounter. After some initial resistance, the company understood the magnitude of the problem. They authorized visual changes to the truck. We applied a different colored stripe to the lower part of the cab, added a large identification number to the doors, changed the position of some of the stickers, and installed small extra markings on the rear and near the door handles. We kept internal records detailing each alteration, with photos and dates, so that any future verification could confirm that this truck, from that moment on, had markings that distinguished it from the clone. In the following months, I was still stopped at a few checkpoints, but the approaches were different. The police officers looked at the new details, compared them with what they had on files or descriptions, and quickly noticed discrepancies. The tension dropped sooner. The questions were less aggressive, and often I was released with a simple wave. At gas stations, comments about, "I saw you here yesterday," practically disappeared. The road taught me many things, but nothing as unsettling as realizing that danger can come from a visual coincidence. It wasn't my cargo that attracted attention. It wasn't my driving style. It was the fact that someone else, somewhere, had decided to use a truck just like mine as a cover for a crime I never saw happen. Today, when I approach a roadblock and see the police officers observing the cab, I know exactly what they're looking for. They're looking for patterns. And I carry in my bodywork the small differences that keep me out of their sights. It's not heroism nor cleverness. It's simply the clear awareness that, on the road, sometimes you're not in danger because of what you're doing, but because of the truck someone has chosen to be your clone. If you're enjoying these chilling stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any more terrifying tales to come. Now, get ready for another journey down dark and mysterious roads. The first clue that something in my routine had ceased to be mere tiredness and coincidence didn't come from a noise in the engine, nor a light on the dashboard, nor anything mechanical. It came from a casual phrase, uttered by a clerk who had never seen me before, at a gas station lost on the edge of New Mexico, when the sun hadn't even decided if it was really going to rise that day. I had left Phoenix the night before, carrying dry cargo to warehouses in the Oklahoma City area. My route went through Arizona, crossed the Texas Panhandle, and continued inland to the delivery point. It was a familiar route with almost automatic stops, but that morning I was ahead of schedule and pulled into a different truck stop, a set of pumps and a store that barely appeared on the map. I parked the red Peterbilt in the corner of the yard, let the engine idle for a few minutes, turned it off, and went to get coffee. Inside, the gas station was like many others. I grabbed a styrofoam cup, poured coffee from the machine, threw in 2 sachets of powdered cream, and walked to the counter. The cashier was checking bills and coins. She looked up for a second, scanned the barcode, told me the price, and while I was getting my wallet, commented that I'd better not overdo it on the coffee because, given how long it usually took me to fall asleep in the booth, it would only prolong the time I spent lying there staring at the ceiling before drifting off. It wasn't a guess. It wasn't a generalization about tired truck drivers. It was a description. She spoke as if she had already been there, by my side, on every sleepless night inside the truck. I paid, thanked them with a short nod, and left. On the way to the parking lot, I mentally lined up acceptable justifications. Maybe I had stopped there before and didn't remember. Maybe someone had mentioned it. Maybe it was just a coincidence shaped by tiredness. The road teaches you to accept explanations like that, because it's easier than admitting anything else. Still clinging to this fragile comfort, I continued my journey. I crossed the border into Texas as the sky slowly began to lighten. Hours later, I stopped at a small gas station in the Amarillo area, just to fill up and use the restroom. I grabbed a bottle of water, a bag of peanuts, and went to the cashier. The guy serving me seemed too young for that shift. He entered the amount into the machine, waited for my card, and while the system processed the transaction, he blurted out that it was always during the weeks I drove the Phoenix, Oklahoma route that the skin on my hands started to crack because of the dry air, and that I'd probably go back to wearing thin cotton gloves under my driving gloves before I even crossed the Oklahoma border. I actually use thin gloves when the dryness gets worse, but it starts inside the cabin, when I feel my rough fingers touching the steering wheel. It's not information you pick up in 5 seconds at a counter. And he spoke casually, as if repeating an obvious fact. I left the store faster than I entered. In the truck, I sat in the seat, left my hands on the steering wheel for a few seconds, observing the calluses and almost healed cuts. I didn't have fixed contact with anyone on that route. Each stop was with new people. Each dock had different employees. There were no recurring faces, no cars, nothing to suggest that someone was following me. Even so, 2 people in different states had spoken of details that belonged to the invisible side of my routine. I continued driving, now paying attention to the small interactions. At a warehouse near Oklahoma City, while waiting for the dock to be cleared, an employee in a reflective vest commented, without me having started the conversation, that my truck cab must have been more organized that week because I had that strange habit of aligning my spare pair of boots by the color of the accumulated dust before going to bed. I had never mentioned this before. It's a mechanical gesture I make alone, behind closed doors, without witnesses. The next day, having already delivered my load and picking up another to head back towards Arizona, I stopped at a gas station near Elk City. I went to the store, grabbed a wrapped sandwich and an energy drink. The cashier looked at my cap for a moment and commented that I must be in that phase of the month where I almost always got my hair cut very short at a roadside barber, because I hated feeling the sweat running down my neck while driving in the desert. That wasn't a deduction based on my current haircut. It was a description of something that kept repeating itself on the calendar. I sensed the pattern in the way she spoke, as if she were citing data that had been circulating for some time. From that point on, I stopped trying to fit events into coincidences. At each stop, market, dock reception, I paid attention to how people moved, observed, and commented to each other. Everything seemed ordinary, but every now and then, someone would utter a short phrase that cut right through my routine, as if they had access to a layer that should be entirely mine. At a gas station on the way back, still in Texas, while I was waiting for the pump to fill the tank, a garbage collector passed by and glanced quickly at my license plates and said that I would probably stop further down at that specific rest area before the New Mexico border, because it was the only place on that route where I could park with the left side of the cab facing away from the traffic, which helped me sleep when my mind started racing. He was right. I've always parked the truck the same way in that spot ever since that first bout of insomnia, when I discovered that, for some reason, I feel safer with the noise coming from a specific side. I've never mentioned this to anyone, and there's no reason for anyone to pay such close attention to the orientation of the cab of one truck among so many. When I got back to Arizona, with the feeling that there was an invisible thread connecting all these encounters, I spent a few days off the road. Basic maintenance, washing, paperwork in order, a bed that doesn't move. I tried to believe I was exaggerating, that the accumulated fatigue was distorting my perception, but the road doesn't like to be ignored. The following week, I returned to another circuit, leaving Los Angeles, California, going up I-15, passing through Las Vegas, crossing Utah, and entering Colorado. Different route, different states, different stops. I thought that, in another scenario, those coincidences would disappear. My first stop in California proved me wrong. I pulled over to a large truck stop off I-10. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, brushed my teeth, then went into the store to get coffee and a stale donut. The cashier, while ringing up the items, commented that I would probably try to go to bed earlier that night because during the weeks I spent driving through Utah, I used to wake up in the middle of the night with that involuntary snap in my left knee, and it would irritate me for hours. There's no way anyone could know that. It wasn't just intimate. It was too specific in terms of timing and the type of discomfort. I kept climbing. At a Nevada gas station, an overly thin attendant asked if the makeshift lumbar support cushion I was using had finally improved, because there was talk going around that I was constantly adjusting the backrest position by lightly tapping my fist behind my back before tackling the longer ramps. In Utah, a dock receptionist said she found it curious that a driver always handwritten down, in a small black notebook, the exact time he docked, even though the digital record was in the system. The notebook is kept in a compartment between the mattress and the inside wall of the cabin. I only take it out when I'm alone. These details weren't just being observed, they were being shared. The confirmation came in Colorado, at a stop near Grand Junction, shortly after crossing the mountains. I went into the store just to grab a hot tea and a packet of biscuits. The guy at the register recognized me by my worn Arizona baseball cap, and with a half smile, commented that he had finally put a face to the guy with the little black notebook and cotton gloves because the guys from other stations kept talking about me in an internal messaging group. I didn't use the word persecution. There was no persecutor. There was never a single continuous stare. What existed was something worse to understand and more difficult to pinpoint. A human chain, an informal joke that spread through the network of people who work at gas stations, convenience stores, docks, and reception areas connected to the routes I travel. He recounted how employees from different locations enjoyed exchanging trivia about frequent drivers. Someone would notice a strange habit, write it down, or record an audio message. Another would repost it in a different state, commenting with colleagues. A third would add a detail observed at another stop. In this way, small pieces of behavior accumulated, traveling for miles, crossing state borders, jumping from shift to shift. Nobody had bad intentions. Nobody wanted to intimidate me. Nobody imagined that, when this information came back to me in the form of casual comments, as if complete strangers knew too much, the effect would be similar to being watched all the time. I returned to the cabin with the tea still warm and the packet of biscuits untouched. I sat on the bed, leaned my back against the inside wall, and closed my eyes for a moment. I imagined all the people I had passed without really looking. All the cashiers, attendants, security guards, dock workers, cleaning staff, cooks, forklift drivers. At some point, one or another of them had noticed something I was doing without thinking and turned it into a small, shareable curiosity. Individually, these details are harmless. Together, they form a map that looks like a chase. That night, in the same cabin where I feel like I control the small world that belongs to me, I realized that every gesture of mine could be observed for too many seconds. I realized that the road didn't need hidden cameras or shadowy agents to create the feeling that private life was dissolving. All it took was a long chain of bored human eyes, connected by group messages and hallway conversations. I lay down as I always do, adjusting the pillow, placing the little black notebook within reach and settling my lower back into the most comfortable position. But now I knew that in several different states there were people who talked about me, without knowing my full name, without remembering my face properly, without realizing that, for someone on this side of the cabin, this sum of details is enough to make anyone question whether there is still in fact any stretch of road where we are truly alone. There's no crime in that. There's no system intrusion, no espionage. There's just too much attention, scattered in small portions, circulating like a kind of telephone game that uses real people instead of cables. And when that entire current organizes itself around you, even unintentionally, the threat doesn't look like an enemy. It looks like something simpler and harder to avoid, the realization that being invisible in the America of long routes might be an illusion that hasn't existed for a long time. On the monitor screen, my truck appeared in 4 different cities as if it were a recurring extra in crimes I never knew happened. In all the recordings, the pattern was the same. The white trailer occupying half the frame, projecting a precise shadow strip, and strange cars using this dark outline as if it were a work tool. No contact with the cab, no attempt to open the cargo area, no chase. I drove, parked, kept to my schedule. Other people used the area behind my trailer as if it were a private corridor away from the cameras and curious eyes. The police officer advanced the images frame by frame. There was no denying it. In Memphis, a gray sedan lingered for 7 seconds in the shadow of the parking garage before exiting through the side of the garage. In Little Rock, 2 cars positioned themselves one behind the other, glued to the rear of my trailer, exactly where the city camera lost its line of sight. In Jackson, a vehicle aligned itself with the end of the trailer to cross a monitored intersection without being recorded. And in Shreveport, the scene was even clearer. Someone was switching volumes between 2 cars, crouching behind my trailer, completely invisible to any observer from the front. None of that existed in my memory. While those scenes were happening, I was counting bills, signing receipts, buying bad coffee, or simply looking the other way. Life on the road had accustomed me to ignoring half the movement around me. But that ignored half now had a name, time, date, and video recording. The sequence that led to that room began simply on a seemingly ordinary Sunday in Arkansas. I had left Dallas with a full tank and a load of industrial components destined for Tennessee and Mississippi. The interstates were as usual. Empty stretches, congested stretches, people rushing past each other, message boards flashing generic safety warnings. The kind of scenario where anything unusual quickly dissolves into the flow. The first stop was in Texarkana, at a truck stop where trucks formed two long lines side by side. I stopped at the far end, with the rear facing a less busy corner. The mid-morning sun beat down strongly on the side of the truck bay, creating a sharp shadow on the asphalt. I got out, checked the tires, looked at the seal, stretched my back. Meanwhile, a dark car slowed down in the lane between the lines and stopped for too long in the shaded area behind my trailer. The approach was slow, calculated. The car remained motionless for a few seconds, then drove off as if nothing had happened. That's something that catches your attention when you're looking for something to be suspicious of. That day, however, my mind was occupied with deadlines, fuel consumption, and the persistent sound of a slight vibration in the cabin. I glanced, only reflexively, without registering the license plate, model, or face. I continued my journey, convinced it was just an indecisive driver looking for a parking space. Later, already in hope, I stopped at a smaller parking lot to use the restroom. I parked next to a shed, again with the rear of the car facing an area with no traffic. When I returned, fresh tire marks cut across the darkest part of the tire tread, where the shadow of the parking garage formed a perfect rectangle. No cars were there at that moment. No employees seemed concerned. Just another visual detail in a place where tire marks accumulate until they disappear. The feeling that something was out of place only began to take shape in Pine Bluff. I was parked in the truck section of a large truck stop, with bright lighting and cameras everywhere. While organizing papers in the cab, I noticed in the side mirror a white sedan approaching from behind. It entered the shadow cast by my trailer, slowed down almost to a stop, moved forward a little, stopped again, remained motionless for a few seconds, and then left through the same entrance it came in, without approaching the pumps, without passing the store. This time, the repetition bothered me more than it should have. It didn't look like a search for a parking spot. It didn't look like a wrong maneuver. It looked like someone testing distances, angles, blind spots. Instead of getting out and checking, I stayed watching through the distorted lens of the rearview mirror until the car disappeared into the flow of traffic. The next day, the pattern became impossible to ignore. At a rest area on I-40 near West Memphis, a black SUV pulled up behind my trailer at such a precise point that the shadow line split the vehicle in half. None of the occupants got out. They stood there for less than 10 seconds, then slowly drove away, unhurried, without any sudden maneuvers. It seemed like a rehearsal. It seemed like someone was using the dark mark on the ground as an invisible reference. There was no way to prove it, no context, but suspicion took hold. I began to realize that the truck, seen from the outside, wasn't just a vehicle and cargo. It was volume. It was a wall. It was an absence of visibility for anyone on the other side. I drove to Memphis with a heavy head, trying to convince myself I was exaggerating. I needed to unload and head to Jackson the next day. I kept to the schedule, delivered the cargo, and parked at a gas station at night. The white light of the yard cut through the trailer's shadow in an almost geometric way, creating a narrow corridor behind the truck. I spent a few minutes watching the movement through the side window of the cab. 2 cars entered and exited the yard without any particular interest in my position. A third, however, slowed down considerably as it approached. It entered the dark corridor, stalled in the shadows, and reappeared at the exit as if it had passed through a tunnel made of absence of light and visual protection. Sleeping after that became an exercise in willpower. In theory, no one had touched the truck. In theory, I was still just one among many. In theory, everything could be a coincidence. However, the reality began to set in the next day. While in Jackson, I was overseeing the repositioning of a loading dock when an employee commented, almost like he was gossiping, that the police had been requesting footage of parking lots with large trucks in the foreground. He mentioned blind spots and shadow lines, laughing as if it were an exaggerated investigation. The comment pierced my heart like a nail. That was exactly what had been occupying my mind at every stop. Once the unloading was complete, I headed to Shreveport with the uneasy feeling that a story was unfolding on the fringes of my routine. It wasn't about me, it was about the space I occupied, about what my presence allowed others to do. I arrived in rural Louisiana late in the afternoon. The warehouse yard was spacious with tall cameras in two corners. I parked where instructed, the back of the trailer forming a white wall against a strip of cracked asphalt. The last bit of sunlight in the sky was blocked by the side of the trailer, and a thick shadow covered the area behind. I handed in the paperwork at the office, waited for the order to pull up to the dock, and when I returned, I saw a car speeding away through the side exit of the yard. Nothing screamed crime. Nothing screamed danger. Just the feeling that something had happened in the few minutes I wasn't looking. 2 hours later, when I had partially forgotten the inconvenience, a supervisor appeared in the cabin asking me to accompany him to the administration room. Inside were 2 state police officers, an open laptop, and a more tense atmosphere than usual. Without beating around the bush, they showed me a clip of a recording. My truck occupying almost the entire frame, its shadow silhouetted against the ground. A car entering the dark field, another approaching from behind, a quick movement of someone between the 2 vehicle doors, and then the cars dispersing as if nothing had happened. The total video time, from the moment the first car enters the shadow until the last one leaves the frame, was no more than 30 seconds. There were no clear faces, no legible license plates, no touching of the truck, but it was clear that without that tall white wall, without that precise shadow strip, the action would have been completely exposed to the camera. The police explained that this wasn't the first time my truck had been spotted in the background. They cited dates, times, and cities. Suddenly, the fragmented scenes from my memory fell into place. The gray sedan in Texarkana, the tire tracks in Hope, the white car in Pine Bluff, the split lane in West Memphis, the SUV in Memphis, the comment in Jackson. Nothing had been a coincidence. I was driving my truck as usual, but someone was using my presence as part of a parallel routine. They asked questions about my route, stopping time, where I usually park, and if anyone had ever tried to approach me persistently. They had nothing to accuse me of, and they knew it. Their explanation was straightforward. A gang had been mapping areas with large trucks to use the shadows and obstructed views as cover for quick exchanges, targeted escapes, and crossings through monitored areas. They didn't choose specific drivers. They chose vehicles that created useful geometries in the space. After I was released, returning to the cabin was like entering a place different from anything I'd known for years. The dashboard, the steering wheel, the smell of stale coffee, everything was the same. What had changed was the way I saw the truck. Before, it was just a cargo box. Now it was a scenic element, a large white piece that redrew the line of sight for cameras, drivers, and pedestrians wherever it went. I continued the route because freight doesn't wait for any crisis. I loaded again, passed through other cities, and kept to the schedule as always. But from then on, no stop was automatic again. Instead of thinking first about the dock, the pump, or the parking space, my instinct started looking directly behind the trailer. A car stopped exactly where the truck's shadow met a low wall and stayed there for a few seconds. In another yard, a hatchback entered and exited the dark rectangle behind the stall without even passing by the store. Nobody touched the truck either time. Seals, locks, cab, everything intact. I remained out of the picture, but my car clearly wasn't. The weight was no longer in the cargo, but in the certainty that the truck's shape could reshape the landscape for anyone who knew how to use those meters of shadow and visual obstruction. The threat never came directly to me. It passed by the edges, used what I was carrying behind me, and disappeared. Today, when I park, I don't just see the painted line in alignment with the exit. I see invisible lines emanating from the back of the trailer, areas that cameras can't reach. I know that if a car slows down there for just a few seconds, something can happen without me seeing it. I'm not being chased, I'm not being targeted, I'm not anyone's target. I'm just the driver of an object too big for someone looking for a quick shield. The truck remains the same, the route almost the same. The difference is that now, when I feel an engine approaching in my blind spot, the feeling is no longer irritation at someone else's maneuver, but rather the uncomfortable certainty that I'm lending my shadow to a story that will never appear on my delivery schedule.